Immortals, released in 2011, emerged during a period when Hollywood was increasingly interested in large-scale fantasy and mythological spectacles. The success of films such as 300, Gladiator, Clash of the Titans, and other visually ambitious historical fantasies had demonstrated that ancient civilizations and legendary stories could be transformed into modern blockbuster entertainment. Rather than adapting one single ancient text, however, Immortals was developed as an original cinematic interpretation inspired by Greek mythology. Its creators took familiar characters, gods, places, and legends from the ancient Greek tradition and reorganized them into a new story designed specifically for the screen. The origins of the project can be traced to a screenplay that initially existed under the title War of the Gods. The script was written by Charles and Vlas Parlapinides, who created a story centered on a mortal hero named Theseus, a brutal king named Hyperion, and a conflict involving the gods of Olympus. The basic premise drew upon several different strands of Greek mythology rather than following the events of one famous myth exactly. Theseus, for example, is traditionally associated with Athens, the Minotaur, the Labyrinth, and the defeat of King Minos's monstrous creature. In Immortals, however, Theseus is given a very different narrative. The filmmakers transformed him into a reluctant hero living in a harsh and oppressive world, where he becomes humanity's potential defender against a tyrant seeking a powerful divine weapon. This approach to mythology was one of the most important creative decisions made during the development of the film. The writers and producers were not attempting to create a historically or mythologically exact retelling. Instead, they used Greek mythology as a vast collection of characters, symbols, conflicts, and ideas. From that collection, they selected elements that could support an original action narrative. Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, Ares, Theseus, Hyperion, the Titans, and the idea of divine intervention all appear in the film, but their relationships and roles are often substantially different from their traditional versions. This gave the project considerable creative freedom. Ancient mythology does not have one single definitive version. Greek myths existed in multiple forms, changed over centuries, and were interpreted differently by poets, playwrights, historians, and artists. Immortals took this flexibility even further. Rather than asking how to faithfully reproduce a particular myth, the filmmakers asked how mythological ideas could be reshaped into a modern cinematic experience. The original concept behind War of the Gods was therefore built around a collision between the human and divine worlds. At its center was the idea that an ordinary mortal could become important not because of royal birth or obvious supernatural power, but because of his character, courage, and willingness to resist oppression. Theseus begins as an outsider, someone viewed by society as insignificant. His journey toward becoming a hero provides the human foundation for a story filled with gods and supernatural forces. At the same time, the script created a villain whose ambitions threatened both humanity and the gods. Hyperion was designed not as a simple mythological character transferred directly from ancient stories, but as a largely reinvented antagonist. His search for the Epirus Bow creates the central external conflict of the film. The weapon has the power to change the balance between mortals, gods, and titans. By making the story revolve around a powerful object, the screenplay gave the narrative a clear dramatic engine. Hyperion wants the bow. The heroes must prevent him from using it, and the consequences of failure extend far beyond one kingdom or one battlefield. This structure helped transform a collection of mythological references into a more recognizable modern adventure story. The screenplay combined several familiar storytelling elements: a chosen or specially selected hero, an ancient weapon, a prophecy, an imprisoned supernatural threat, a ruthless tyrant, and a conflict between divine rules and human survival. These elements were not new individually, but the project attempted to distinguish itself through its visual identity and its highly stylized interpretation of the ancient world. The development of the screenplay also reflected a broader Hollywood trend. Studios were looking for projects with recognizable concepts that could still be marketed as new. Greek mythology offered a useful combination of familiarity and flexibility. Audiences might recognize names such as Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, and Theseus, even if they were not experts on classical mythology. At the same time, the filmmakers were not constrained by the expectations associated with adapting a recent best-selling novel or a famous modern franchise. This allowed the creators of Immortals to build a mythology-based world without having to reproduce a pre-existing fictional universe exactly. The film could use recognizable mythological material while creating its own continuity. In effect, the ancient myths became raw material rather than a strict blueprint. The project eventually attracted the involvement of producers interested in large-scale visual filmmaking. One of the key creative figures associated with the production was Johnny Nunari, who had experience with ambitious historical and mythological projects. The involvement of producer Mark Hanton also helped position the film as a major studio-scale production. The project was developed as a spectacle that could appeal to international audiences, combining action, fantasy, mythology, and highly distinctive visual design. The arrival of director Tarsem Singh was especially significant because it changed the identity of the project. Tarsem was already known for his extraordinary visual imagination. His earlier films, including The Cell and The Fall, demonstrated a fascination with surreal imagery, elaborate compositions, striking costumes, carefully constructed environments, and images that often resembled paintings or dreams. Bringing him onto Immortals suggested that the film would not simply attempt to recreate ancient Greece realistically. Instead, the project evolved toward a more stylized and subjective vision of mythology. The ancient world of Immortals would be recognizable in broad terms, but it would not be presented as an archaeological reconstruction. Tarsem's approach favored heightened reality. Tarsem Singh's vision was one of the defining forces behind Immortals. Although the film began with a screenplay that combined Greek mythology, fantasy, and action, Tarsem transformed the project into something that was meant to be experienced as much through images as through dialogue or plot. His approach to filmmaking has always been strongly connected to visual composition, symbolism, color, architecture, costume, and the emotional effect of individual images. With Immortals, he applied that philosophy to the ancient world and created a version of Greek mythology that was deliberately stylized, artificial, dreamlike, and larger than life. Tarsem did not approach Immortals as a conventional historical epic. His goal was not to recreate ancient Greece with archaeological precision. Instead, he treated mythology as an imaginative space. For him, the world of gods, titans, prophecies, and legendary heroes offered an opportunity to create images that could exist outside ordinary reality. The film therefore operates according to a heightened visual logic. Landscapes appear sculpted. Cities and temples often resemble enormous pieces of architecture placed inside a painting. Characters wear costumes that emphasize shape and silhouette rather than historical realism. Even violence is frequently arranged with a sense of choreography and visual composition. This artistic approach can be understood by looking at Tarsem's earlier career. Before becoming widely known as a feature film director, he built a reputation through commercials and music videos. That background taught him how to communicate ideas quickly and visually. A commercial often has only a short amount of time to establish a mood, a world, or a memorable image. Music videos similarly rely on atmosphere, rhythm, and visual identity. Tarsem carried these instincts into feature filmmaking, where he developed a style based on images that remain memorable even when separated from a plot. His first major feature, The Cell, demonstrated this tendency clearly. The film used surreal environments and elaborate visual concepts to represent psychological spaces. The Fall took this visual philosophy even further, presenting an epic story filled with locations and imagery that often seemed impossible or fantastical, even though much of the imagery was created through real-world locations rather than depending entirely on digital environments. By the time Tarsem became involved with Immortals, he had already established himself as a filmmaker more interested in creating a distinctive cinematic experience than in following the visual conventions of a particular genre. This made him an unusual but logical choice for a mythological action film. Greek mythology had been depicted many times in cinema, often through historical spectacle, traditional fantasy, or adventure. Tarsem had the opportunity to give the material a different identity. One of his central artistic goals was to create a world that felt like a series of moving paintings. This idea shaped nearly every part of Immortals. The camera frequently frames characters against vast backgrounds, placing them in carefully balanced arrangements. Human figures are often positioned against cliffs, walls, temples, skies, or enormous architectural structures, instead of allowing environments to exist only as realistic settings. The production uses them as graphic elements within the frame. This approach is particularly visible in scenes involving the gods. The gods are not simply presented as powerful humans standing in ordinary rooms. Their spaces are designed to emphasize separation from the mortal world. The visual difference between gods and humans communicates hierarchy. Mortals live in a world of dirt, war, imprisonment, and physical suffering. The gods exist in a realm that appears cleaner, more controlled, and more abstract. Tarsem's filmmaking philosophy often involves exaggerating contrasts. In Immortals, the contrast between mortality and immortality is not expressed only through dialogue. It is built into the images. Human beings bleed, age, suffer, and struggle through environments that appear physically harsh. The gods are composed with greater elegance and distance. When they enter action, however, the contrast becomes even more dramatic because their movements can appear impossibly fast or powerful. This brings us to another major influence on the film's style: the use of slow motion and altered perception. Action cinema frequently uses slow motion to make violence easier to observe or to emphasize a decisive moment. In Immortals, slow motion has a more aesthetic function. It allows the audience to study the composition of movement. Blood, weapons, bodies, and fragments of the environment can remain suspended long enough for the viewer to appreciate the visual design of the action. Tarsem's use of slow motion is especially important during the scenes involving divine combat. The gods move at extraordinary speed compared with ordinary humans, and the film uses this difference to create a visual distinction between mortal and immortal beings. The technique is not merely intended to make the action look impressive. It supports the world building. The audience sees that the gods experience physical conflict differently. The action scenes therefore become extensions of Tarsem's larger artistic philosophy. They are not designed purely around realism or tactical clarity. Instead, they're designed around impact, rhythm, visual contrast, and the arrangement of bodies in space. A fight can become a piece of moving sculpture. A warrior's death can become an image. A weapon can function as a line moving across the frame. This painterly quality was influenced by Tarsem's interest in art history and visual culture. Rather than presenting ancient Greece through the muted realism often associated with historical films, Immortals uses compositions that can suggest religious paintings, classical sculpture, fantasy illustration, and surrealist imagery. The film frequently feels as though its characters have stepped into an artistic representation of mythology rather than into a realistic reconstruction of the ancient Mediterranean world. This was a deliberate choice. Tarsem's approach suggests that mythology should not necessarily look ordinary. Myths are stories about people and gods operating at an extreme level of existence. Immortals constructs its world as a mythological universe rather than a historically accurate version of ancient Greece. This distinction is essential to understanding how the film approaches world building. The movie uses recognizable Greek names, gods, places, symbols, and ideas, but rearranges them into a self-contained fictional setting with its own rules. Ancient mythology provides the foundation, yet the world seen on screen is shaped by fantasy, visual symbolism, and the specific needs of the narrative. The setting is therefore less concerned with historical realism than with emotional and mythological atmosphere. The world of Immortals feels ancient, but it is difficult to connect it to one exact period of Greek history. Its cities, weapons, clothing, architecture, and landscapes borrow from different visual traditions and combine them into something deliberately timeless. The result is a world that seems to exist outside ordinary history. It is an ancient land, but also a dreamlike space where gods can descend from the heavens, supernatural weapons can alter the balance of power, and forgotten titans remain imprisoned beneath the earth. This approach immediately separates Immortals from a conventional historical epic. In a realistic historical film, the environment would usually be designed to convince the audience that the events could have taken place in a specific time and location. The buildings would reflect recognizable architectural traditions. The costumes would attempt to reproduce historical clothing, and geography would follow a relatively logical structure. Immortals instead creates an impressionistic version of antiquity. The environment is designed to communicate mood, danger, power, isolation, and spiritual significance. The world is constructed around several distinct levels of existence. The first and most important is the mortal world. This is where ordinary people live, work, suffer, fight, and die. It is a harsh environment shaped by political violence, invasion, fear, and social inequality. Mortals have little control over the forces that influence their lives. Kings can destroy communities. Armies can conquer entire regions. Natural landscapes can isolate populations. Above all, supernatural powers exist, but ordinary people cannot depend on those powers for protection. This sense of vulnerability is central to the film's environmental storytelling. The human world often feels exposed. Villages are not presented as completely safe homes protected by stable institutions. Instead, they exist in a landscape where violence can arrive suddenly. People can be captured, killed, enslaved, or displaced. The physical environment reflects this instability. Mountains, cliffs, open plains, narrow passages, and massive structures create spaces where human beings appear small. These visual relationships between people and their surroundings communicate one of the film's central ideas. Humanity exists inside forces much larger than itself. The individual may be courageous, but courage does not make the environment less dangerous. Theseus begins his journey as a single person within an enormous and violent world. The scale of the setting constantly reminds the audience of his apparent insignificance. At the same time, the world is not simply hostile because of nature. Much of its danger is created by human ambition. Hyperion's campaign transforms the landscape into a space of conquest. His army moves through territories as a destructive force, leaving behind fear and death. This creates an important distinction between the natural world and the political world. Mountains and cliffs may be dangerous, but they do not choose to oppress anyone. Hyperion does. The setting, therefore, becomes an extension of the central conflict. As Hyperion searches for the Epirus Bow, different locations are transformed into stages for his obsession. Sacred spaces are violated. Populations are threatened. Prisons become instruments of control. The physical world becomes increasingly shaped by the consequences of his ambition. The film's interpretation of ancient Greece is especially interesting because it does not attempt to present a unified civilization. Instead, the world feels fragmented. Different groups, cities, rulers, and communities exist within a larger territory, but there is no overwhelming sense of political stability. This fragmentation creates an ideal environment for a figure such as Hyperion to rise. In a divided world, a powerful and ruthless leader can exploit fear and weakness. This also helps explain why Theseus can begin as an outsider. The world does not immediately recognize or protect exceptional individuals. Social position matters. Reputation matters. Power matters. A person without wealth, status, or political influence can easily be dismissed. Theseus is therefore shaped by a setting in which survival often depends on strength, alliances, and personal resilience. One of the most important aspects of the film's world-building is the division between mortals and gods. The gods of Immortals exist within the same universe as humanity, but they do not inhabit the same ordinary reality. Their relationship with mortals is defined by distance. They observe humanity from above, and they possess the ability to intervene, but their power is governed by rules. This rule is essential to the logic of the universe. The gods cannot simply solve every human problem. If they could, there would be little need for mortal heroes. The world building, therefore, establishes a system in which divine beings are enormously powerful, but politically and morally restricted. Zeus represents the authority responsible for maintaining this boundary. The gods can observe humanity and may influence events under certain circumstances, but excessive or unauthorized interference carries consequences. This creates a form of cosmic law. Divine power exists, but even divine beings must respect a larger order. The result is a universe in which mortals are never entirely alone, yet they cannot rely on being rescued. This is a powerful source of tension. The audience knows that Zeus and the other gods are capable of extraordinary actions, but the characters cannot assume that help will arrive. This rule also changes the meaning of faith. In many fantasy stories, faith involves believing in a supernatural force whose existence is uncertain. In Immortals, the gods are real, at least from the perspective of the audience. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether they will act. Immortals is primarily a mythological fantasy action film, but describing it with only one genre label would overlook the way it combines several different traditions. The movie brings together epic fantasy, historical adventure, heroic mythology, sword and sandal spectacle, supernatural drama, war cinema, and elements of the quest narrative. Its genre identity is built from familiar components, yet the film presents them through an unusually stylized visual approach. The primary genre is fantasy. The world of Immortals contains gods who physically exist, supernatural weapons, prophetic visions, ancient cosmic wars, immortal beings, and titans imprisoned beyond the ordinary human world. These elements immediately move the film beyond historical drama. Although the story uses an ancient Greek setting, its most important conflicts depend on forces that cannot be explained through ordinary history. Fantasy is particularly important because it gives the film freedom to reinterpret mythology. Immortals is not required to follow historical reality, and it does not attempt to recreate Greek mythology with complete accuracy. Instead, it constructs its own version of a mythological universe. Characters such as Theseus, Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, and Ares are recognizable, but their relationships and actions are shaped according to the needs of this particular story. The film therefore belongs to a branch of fantasy that uses mythology as source material. Rather than inventing an entirely new pantheon or fictional civilization, it takes familiar legendary figures and reorganizes them. This approach allows the audience to enter the story with a basic sense of recognition while still encountering unexpected changes. The gods provide the clearest example of the film's fantasy identity. They are not symbolic or metaphorical. They are active characters who possess extraordinary abilities. Their presence establishes that the universe operates according to rules different from the real world. The gods can move with impossible speed. They possess physical power beyond that of ordinary humans. They exist outside the limitations of mortality. They can observe and, under certain circumstances, influence human events. At the same time, they are not completely unrestricted. The film creates dramatic tension by establishing rules that limit divine intervention. This is a familiar fantasy technique. Extraordinary power becomes more interesting when it has boundaries. If Zeus could simply destroy every enemy threatening humanity, the central conflict would disappear. The rules governing divine behavior, therefore, create a situation in which mortals must continue to matter. This brings Immortals into contact with another major genre tradition, the heroic adventure. The story follows a protagonist who begins in a relatively ordinary and powerless position before becoming involved in a conflict of increasing importance. Theseus is not initially presented as a king commanding armies or as an established legendary warrior. He is an outsider whose potential must be discovered and developed. This is one of the oldest structures in adventure storytelling. An individual begins at the edge of society or outside the main centers of power. Circumstances force that individual into a larger conflict. Along the way, the protagonist encounters mentors, allies, enemies, tests, revelations, and losses. Eventually, the character must confront a threat that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the story. Immortals follows this structure closely, which makes it accessible even when the mythology itself is heavily modified. Theseus functions as the audience's entry point into the world. The audience may know more about the existence of the gods than he does at certain moments, but his understanding of the larger conflict expands gradually. As he learns about Hyperion's ambitions and the supernatural forces surrounding him, the scale of the narrative grows. This movement from the personal to the cosmic is a classic fantasy and adventure pattern. At the beginning, the stakes are connected to survival, oppression, and immediate danger. Later, the conflict expands to include prophecy and the search for the Epirus Bow. Eventually, the possibility of releasing the Titans transforms the conflict into a threat to the entire order of the universe. The escalation of stakes is one of the film's most conventional genre elements. The hero begins with a problem that can be understood on a human level, but that problem gradually reveals a larger and more dangerous structure. The secondary genre most strongly associated with Immortals is the sword and sandal epic. This genre has a long history in cinema. It traditionally involves ancient civilizations, warriors, kings, gladiators, legendary heroes, armies, temples, battles, and conflicts involving power and conquest. Earlier examples often focused on Greece, Rome, Egypt, or fictionalized versions of the ancient Mediterranean world. Immortals clearly inherits this tradition. The film contains swords, shields, armies, fortresses, ancient rulers, religious structures, and large-scale battles. Its protagonist is a physically capable warrior, while its antagonist is a tyrannical ruler seeking power through violence. However, Immortals differs from many traditional sword and sandal films because of its extreme visual stylization. Classic examples of the genre often attempted, at least to some degree, to create a convincing version of the ancient world. Even when historical accuracy was limited, the films generally presented recognizable cities, armies, and environments. Immortals is much less interested in that type of realism. Its ancient world is shaped like a fantasy landscape. Its architecture is exaggerated. Its costumes often appear sculptural and symbolic. Its action is choreographed around visual composition. Its environments frequently resemble paintings rather than ordinary historical locations. This is where the film begins to reinvent the conventions of the sword and sandal genre. Instead of using ancient history to create realism, it uses antiquity as a visual language. A helmet, a temple, a mountain, or a sword does not simply establish the historical period. Each object becomes part of the film's overall design. The result is a version of the ancient epic filtered through modern visual spectacle. The opening sequence of Immortals is designed to accomplish something very specific. Before the audience meets Theseus in his ordinary human life, the film first establishes that the universe is governed by ancient powers, forgotten conflicts, prophecy, and forces that exist beyond normal human understanding. The opening does not simply begin the hero's personal story. It begins much higher at the level of mythology itself, and then gradually brings the audience down into the mortal world. This structure is important because Immortals has an unusually large mythology to introduce. The story involves gods, titans, a legendary weapon, an ancient war, a brutal human ruler, a prophetic oracle, and a mortal hero whose choices eventually become connected to all of these elements. If the film immediately began with Theseus living his ordinary life, the supernatural dimensions of the story would have to be introduced later through lengthy explanations. Instead, the opening establishes the larger universe first. The film begins with a powerful mythological image. A young man is being prepared for a confrontation with an older, seemingly imprisoned figure. The sequence immediately creates the impression that the audience is witnessing something ancient and significant. There's an atmosphere of secrecy and ritual surrounding the events. The film is not initially concerned with explaining everything in a straightforward way. It wants the audience to feel that they have entered a story that began long before the main protagonist was born. This is an important technique in fantasy storytelling. Instead of starting with a complete explanation of the mythology, the film introduces mystery. The audience sees evidence of an ancient conflict before understanding its full history. This encourages curiosity. Who are these people? Why is this imprisoned figure important? What happened in the distant past? What is the connection between this ancient event and the story that will follow? The opening, therefore, establishes one of the film's most important principles. The present is controlled by the consequences of the past. The mythology of Immortals is not merely background information. Ancient events continue to influence the modern characters. The gods remember what happened before. The Titans remain a threat because of an earlier conflict. The existence of the Epirus Bow is connected to a history that predates Theseus. The villain's ambitions depend upon reopening a conflict that has been dormant for generations. The opening sequence introduces this sense of historical depth before the audience has even become attached to the human characters. One of the most important figures introduced early is Zeus. Although the audience initially encounters him in a form that creates mystery rather than immediately explaining everything about him. The presence of a divine figure establishes that the film's universe contains beings who exist at a level above ordinary humanity. The opening also introduces the concept of the Titans and the ancient conflict between them and the gods. This is crucial because the Titans become one of the film's ultimate threats. The audience needs to understand that they are not simply monsters who appear randomly near the end of the story. They're connected to the origins of the existing divine order. The Titans represent something older than the gods themselves. Their imprisonment, therefore, becomes a fundamental part of the world structure. This is an important distinction between ordinary fantasy villains and mythological forces. A normal villain might rise within the story and threaten the established order. The Titans existed before the current order was established. Their return would therefore mean more than the victory of one enemy over another. It could represent the collapse of the existing universe. The opening communicates this idea through mythology rather than through a long explanation. The audience learns that the gods defeated and imprisoned the Titans, and that the knowledge of their existence has not entirely disappeared. The story, therefore, begins with the memory of a previous cosmic struggle. This gives the film an almost legendary quality from its first moments. The opening sequence also establishes a relationship between knowledge and power. Certain characters know about the ancient forces and understand their significance. Ordinary humans do not necessarily possess this information. This creates a hierarchy of knowledge that parallels the hierarchy of power. The gods know more than mortals. The people connected to prophecy know more than ordinary people. Hyperion eventually learns about the supernatural weapon and the imprisoned Titans. Theseus begins with very limited knowledge and must gradually discover the larger reality surrounding him. This makes the audience's experience similar to Theseus's. Although the opening provides information that he does not yet possess, the film still carefully controls what the audience understands. The world is revealed in stages. After establishing the ancient mythological background, the film shifts toward the mortal world. This transition is essential because it creates a contrast between the enormous scale of the mythology and the relatively humble life of the protagonist. Theseus is introduced not as a legendary king, but as a young man living in a difficult environment with his mother. He has been raised in poverty and social isolation. His life is shaped by violence, fear, and the constant threat of people more powerful than himself. This is a deliberate contrast with the opening. The audience has just been shown beings associated with enormous supernatural power. Then the story introduces a mortal who possesses none of that power. The gods exist above. Theseus exists below. The Titans are imprisoned beneath the world. Theseus lives on its surface. This vertical structure becomes a recurring visual and thematic pattern throughout the film. Theseus's early life also establishes his first important emotional relationship, his bond with his mother. His mother is not simply a supporting character. She is central to understanding his personality. Their relationship gives him an emotional foundation and provides the audience with a reason to care about what happens to him. Theseus has been raised in a world that does not treat him as important. He does not have royal status or social privilege. He is instead defined by his relationship with his mother and by his ability to survive. This makes his eventual transformation into a legendary hero more meaningful. The central conflict in Immortals is built around a collision between human ambition, personal revenge, divine responsibility, and the threat of an ancient supernatural force. On the surface, the story appears relatively straightforward. Hyperion, a ruthless king, wants to obtain the Epirus Bow and use it to release the Titans, while Theseus becomes increasingly determined to stop him. But underneath that basic action plot are several overlapping conflicts that operate at different levels. Theseus is fighting Hyperion, but he is also fighting his own anger, grief, fear, and uncertainty. Hyperion is fighting the gods, but he is also fighting his own sense of suffering and injustice. The gods are fighting to preserve the existing order, while simultaneously struggling with the limitations placed upon their ability to intervene. The result is a conflict structure that constantly moves between the personal, political, mythological, and cosmic levels. The most important external conflict is the struggle between Theseus and Hyperion. These two characters represent opposite responses to suffering. Both exist in a brutal world. Both understand violence. Both have experienced loss. Both possess the potential to use force. But their moral choices are radically different. Theseus is introduced as a young man who has been shaped by hardship. He has grown up without social privilege and has been forced to become physically capable because the world around him is dangerous. His relationship with his mother gives him an emotional connection to compassion and responsibility. Although he is capable of violence, he does not initially seek domination. His strength is defensive. Hyperion, by contrast, transforms suffering into hatred. His personal losses become justification for destroying the established order. Rather than simply wanting justice, he wants revenge on the gods and is willing to destroy countless human lives to accomplish it. This difference creates the central moral opposition of the film. Both characters have suffered. One becomes a protector, the other becomes a destroyer. This makes their conflict more meaningful than a simple battle between a hero and an evil ruler. Hyperion functions as a dark reflection of Theseus. He represents what Theseus could potentially become if anger and grief were allowed to control his identity. This is particularly important because Theseus is not presented as naturally peaceful. He is angry. He is capable of brutality. He has been trained to fight. He lives in an environment where violence is often the only way to survive. The question is therefore not whether Theseus possesses violence. He clearly does. The question is what he chooses to do with it. This becomes one of the major internal conflicts of the movie. Theseus must learn the difference between fighting because he is angry and fighting because something is worth protecting. At the beginning of his journey, his emotions are heavily influenced by his personal experiences. He has a strong desire to defend his mother and resist the people who have abused or humiliated him. His anger gives him energy, but it can also make him vulnerable to impulsive decisions. As the story develops, his motivation expands. He begins with the desire to protect what is personally important to him. He gradually becomes concerned with the survival of others. Eventually, his actions become connected to the survival of humanity itself. This expansion of motivation is essential to the hero's development. A character who fights only for revenge remains trapped inside the past. A character who learns to fight for something larger than himself becomes a hero. The film uses Theseus's development to explore that distinction. The external conflict begins before Theseus fully understands what is happening. Hyperion's army is already moving through the world. Hyperion is searching for the Epirus Bow. He is preparing for a larger objective that involves the Titans. This creates a sense of urgency. Theseus does not have unlimited time to grow into a hero. The enemy is not waiting. The threat is advancing while the protagonist is still learning. This is one of the most effective mechanisms for maintaining tension in an action narrative. The protagonist is inexperienced. The antagonist is already active. The audience knows the villain's plan is progressing. The hero must catch up. This creates dramatic pressure because the audience can imagine what will happen if the hero fails to develop quickly enough. Hyperion's objective also creates a clear external goal. He wants the Epirus Bow because it provides the means to attack the Titan's prison. The bow therefore functions as a physical representation of the conflict. Whoever controls the weapon can influence the future of the world. This makes the conflict easier for the audience to follow because the abstract threat has been connected to a concrete object. Instead of simply saying that the world is in danger, the film gives the characters something specific to find, protect, and fight over. The Epirus Bow therefore becomes a traditional fantasy artifact. It has an ancient history. It possesses extraordinary power. The antagonist wants it. The protagonist becomes connected to its protection. Its location affects the movement of the story. The artifact structure also allows the film to transition between different types of conflict. Characters can fight over the weapon physically. They can search for it. They can discuss its significance. They can attempt to hide it. They can use it as a bargaining tool. This makes the object a narrative engine. The conflict is not static. The characters are constantly moving toward or away from the possibility of controlling it. The threat posed by the Titans raises the stakes further. Hyperion's plan is dangerous because the Titans are not ordinary enemies. They represent a force capable of challenging the gods themselves. This changes the meaning of victory. If Theseus simply defeats Hyperion, the problem may not be completely solved. The larger question is whether the Titans will be released. This creates a layered hierarchy of threats. At the lowest level, individuals are fighting for survival. At the next level, armies are fighting for territory. At a larger level, Hyperion is fighting against the gods. At the highest level, the release of the Titans threatens the structure of the entire world. The film therefore escalates its stakes from personal to political to cosmic. This is a classic epic structure. The hero's personal life is gradually absorbed into a much larger conflict. The central villain of Immortals is Hyperion, played by Rourke, but the film's antagonistic structure is larger than a single character. Hyperion is the primary human antagonist, yet he operates within a network of opposing forces that includes his armies, corrupt political power, violent soldiers, supernatural threats, and the Titans themselves. Even the limitations and disagreements within the divine world can function as obstacles to the heroes. This layered approach is important because the film is built as an epic. A single villain cannot provide every level of opposition required by a story that moves from personal revenge to a conflict involving gods and ancient supernatural beings. Hyperion is the central figure holding these different antagonistic elements together. He gives the story a human face for its immediate threat. The audience can understand his actions, follow his movements, and recognize his objective long before the full supernatural consequences of his plan become clear. At first, Hyperion appears to be a ruthless conqueror. He commands armies, destroys communities, takes prisoners, and uses fear as an instrument of control. He is not presented as someone interested in compromise. His political philosophy is essentially based on force. If he has enough power to take something, he believes he has the right to take it. This makes him a recognizable tyrant archetype. The tyrant is one of the oldest villain figures in storytelling. He represents authority without compassion, strength without responsibility, and power without accountability. The tyrant does not need to persuade everyone that he is morally correct. He only needs enough force to make resistance dangerous. Hyperion fits this tradition, but the film gives him an additional dimension through his personal history. His motivation is rooted in suffering and revenge. He has experienced devastating loss, and that loss has transformed his relationship with the gods. Rather than accepting his suffering as something that happened to him, he directs his anger toward the divine order itself. This is what makes him more interesting than a villain who simply wants wealth or domination. Hyperion wants to punish the gods. He wants to destroy the order that he believes has failed him. He wants to unleash forces that were imprisoned by the gods. He is willing to use humanity as a tool to accomplish this objective. His motivation is therefore personal, political, and cosmic at the same time. This creates a parallel between Hyperion and Theseus. Both men are shaped by suffering. Both have experienced loss. Both have learned that the world can be cruel. Both understand violence, but they respond differently. Theseus gradually turns his suffering into a reason to protect others. Hyperion turns his suffering into a reason to destroy others. This contrast is one of the most important symbolic functions of Hyperion. He is not merely an enemy that Theseus must physically defeat. He is an example of what happens when pain becomes an identity. Hyperion has allowed his anger to become the organizing principle of his existence. Everything he does is connected to revenge. His armies are instruments of revenge. His search for the Epirus Bow is part of revenge. His desire to release the Titans is part of revenge. His willingness to sacrifice human lives is justified by revenge. The longer his plan continues, the less important the original suffering becomes. The revenge itself becomes the goal. This is a familiar pattern in tragic villainy. A character begins with a grievance that may be understandable, but the response becomes so extreme that the original grievance no longer explains the scale of the destruction. Hyperion eventually wants to destroy an entire system because he believes that system caused his pain. His tragedy is that he becomes similar to the forces he hates. He sees the gods as cruel and indifferent, yet he becomes cruel and indifferent toward ordinary human beings. He hates the use of power against the powerless, yet he uses power against people who cannot defend themselves. He believes himself to be acting against injustice, but his methods reproduce the same violence he claims to oppose. This contradiction is central to his character. It also makes him an effective antagonist because his ideology creates a direct challenge to Theseus's developing worldview. Theseus is forced to ask what separates a hero from a tyrant if both possess the ability to use violence. The answer is not strength. It is purpose. It is restraint. It is responsibility. Hyperion has strength without those qualities. That makes him dangerous. His physical power is reinforced by his willingness to cross moral boundaries. He is prepared to sacrifice anyone who becomes inconvenient. This means the audience cannot rely on conventional assumptions about limits. A villain becomes more threatening when the audience believes that he may actually do the worst thing available to him. Hyperion establishes this early. He does not need to be constantly present for his threat to remain active. His army carries his violence across the landscape. His orders continue to affect the characters even when he is not on screen. This creates a sense that Hyperion is larger than the individual man. He becomes a system of violence. The army is an extension of his personality. The soldiers carry out his will. The conquered territories demonstrate the consequences of his decisions. His reputation creates fear before he personally enters a scene. This is a classic method of building an antagonist. The villain's reputation arrives before the villain. By the time the audience fully understands Hyperion's intentions, it already understands that he represents danger. His army is therefore the first major layer of antagonistic force. The soldiers are not individually developed in great detail, but collectively they create scale. A single enemy can be defeated. An army creates a strategic problem. Theseus cannot simply rely on individual combat skill when facing overwhelming numbers. He needs allies. He needs planning. He needs the cooperation of other people. The army therefore forces the hero to become more than a fighter. He must become a leader. This is important to his character development. If Hyperion had only one henchman, Theseus could simply defeat that person and move forward. By giving Hyperion an entire military force, the film makes the conflict larger than personal revenge. Theseus has to participate in a war. The story of Immortals can be understood very effectively through the hero's journey, the three-act structure, and several elements of the Save the Cat model. Although the film does not follow every stage of these frameworks in a perfectly traditional way, its Theseus's development clearly follows the broad pattern of an ordinary individual being pushed into an extraordinary conflict, receiving guidance, suffering major losses, discovering his purpose, confronting overwhelming forces, and ultimately becoming a legendary figure. The protagonist is Theseus, a mortal warrior who begins the story as an outsider rather than an established hero. This is an important starting point. Theseus is not introduced as a famous soldier, prince, king, or chosen warrior who already understands his destiny. He is an ordinary man living in a harsh environment, shaped by poverty, violence, and the need to protect his mother. His humble position is essential because the story is ultimately about transformation. If Theseus began as a powerful warrior, there would be less room for development. Instead, the audience is asked to watch him become a hero. The hero's journey begins with the ordinary world. In Theseus's ordinary world, life is difficult and dangerous. He lives with his mother in relative isolation, and he has grown up under circumstances that have taught him to distrust authority and rely on himself. His relationship with his mother establishes an important emotional foundation. She is one of the few people with whom he has a genuine bond, and his concern for her gives him a reason to act that is more personal than the larger mythology that will eventually surround him. At this stage, Theseus is not yet thinking about saving humanity. He is not concerned with the gods. He does not fully understand the Titans. He is not looking for an epic destiny. His world is small. His concerns are immediate. He wants to survive. He wants to protect his mother. He wants to resist the people who have power over him. This is precisely what makes the later transformation so significant. The hero's journey often begins with a character who does not yet understand the scale of the world outside his immediate environment. Theseus's ordinary world provides that starting point. The first major stage of his transformation is the call to adventure. In a conventional hero's journey, the protagonist receives some form of invitation to leave the ordinary world and enter a larger conflict. For Theseus, that call comes through the growing threat of Hyperion and the forces moving through his homeland. The arrival of the enemy disrupts his life. His personal world is no longer safe. The conflict he has tried to survive becomes connected to something much larger. The search for the Epirus Bow and the threat of the Titans create the larger adventure that will eventually consume his life. The important thing about this call is that Theseus does not initially choose it in the way a traditional adventurer might choose a quest. He is forced into it. The hero's journey often works through disruption. Something enters the protagonist's life and makes remaining in the ordinary world impossible. For Theseus, the invasion and the destruction surrounding him perform that function. The call becomes personal because the people he loves are endangered. His mother is not simply part of his background. She is the emotional bridge between his old life and his new one. The destruction of his ordinary world therefore forces him to move forward. This leads to one of the most important stages in the hero's journey, the crossing of the threshold. The threshold is the point at which the protagonist leaves the familiar world and enters the unfamiliar one. For Theseus, this involves becoming part of a conflict that extends far beyond his original understanding. He moves from being a solitary survivor to becoming involved with warriors, prisoners, oracles, gods, supernatural forces, and a war that could affect the entire human world. The scale of his existence expands dramatically. Before the threshold, his world is defined by his personal circumstances. After the threshold, his decisions begin to have consequences for other people. This is one of the clearest indicators that he has entered the heroic phase of the story. He is no longer fighting only for himself. The next stage is often called meeting the mentor. In Immortals, this role is divided among several characters and influences rather than being represented by one traditional mentor figure. Zeus is the most obvious supernatural mentor. He has knowledge that Theseus does not possess. He understands the nature of the Titans. He understands the dangers surrounding the Epirus Bow. He recognizes that Theseus has qualities that could make him important. However, Zeus does not simply train Theseus in the traditional sense. He cannot openly solve every problem for him. The gods are restricted by rules concerning their intervention in the human world. This makes Zeus a somewhat unusual mentor. Instead of giving Theseus unlimited assistance, he allows the mortal to make his own choices. This is significant because the purpose of a mentor in the hero's journey is not necessarily to do the work for the hero. The mentor provides knowledge, perspective, training, or inspiration. The hero must ultimately act alone. Theseus's relationship with Zeus, therefore, fits the structure. Zeus can help him understand the larger world, but Theseus must ultimately decide what to do. Another mentor figure is his mother. Although she is not a warrior or supernatural guide, she provides the moral foundation for his character. She represents compassion. She represents family. She reminds him that strength has a purpose. Her influence remains important even after she is no longer physically present. In a symbolic sense, her teachings become part of his internal guidance system. This is another common feature of heroic storytelling. The mentor does not always remain alive throughout the story. Sometimes the mentor's greatest influence occurs after a loss. The hero carries the mentor's lessons into the later stages of the journey. Phaedra also becomes a major source of guidance. As an oracle, she possesses knowledge of possible futures. Her relationship with Theseus is different from Zeus's. Zeus represents divine knowledge and restraint. Phaedra represents human vulnerability combined with supernatural insight. She does not simply tell Theseus what to do. Her visions create uncertainty. They force him to think about destiny. She also becomes an emotional connection for him. Immortals was designed as a large-scale visual spectacle, and its technology and special effects were central to the movie's identity. The filmmakers were not attempting to create a historically realistic representation of ancient Greece. Instead, they created a stylized, mythological world in which human beings, gods, monsters, architecture, weapons, landscapes, and supernatural events could all be presented with an exaggerated visual intensity. The movie's visual effects were therefore not simply used to make impossible things appear on screen. They were used to establish the rules of the world. They helped distinguish gods from humans. They gave the Titans their overwhelming presence. They allowed supernatural weapons to become believable. They transformed ordinary landscapes into mythological environments. They also helped create the film's particular visual language, which combines computer-generated imagery, practical sets, digital environments, makeup, prosthetics, stunt work, choreography, compositing, slow motion, and highly controlled cinematography. The result is a movie that often looks more like a moving painting or graphic novel than a conventional historical epic. This visual philosophy was one of the defining characteristics of the production. The first thing to understand about the effects work on Immortals is that the filmmakers were creating a world rather than simply adding isolated effects shots. A visual effect can be spectacular on its own, but it becomes much more useful when it establishes something about the fictional universe. In Immortals, digital imagery helps establish the difference between ordinary human reality and the supernatural realm. The gods do not simply look like powerful humans. They move differently. They appear in environments that feel removed from normal physical reality. Their armor and weapons have an otherworldly quality. Their appearances are frequently surrounded by heightened lighting and compositing. Their battles take place at speeds and scales that ordinary human warriors cannot match. The technology, therefore, contributes to storytelling. The visual effects tell the audience who these beings are. One of the most recognizable technological features of the movie is its use of computer-generated imagery to create large-scale environments and supernatural elements. Ancient Greek mythology presents a particular problem for filmmakers because the stories involve locations that do not exist in the modern world and beings that cannot be filmed directly. The production, therefore, had to combine physical filmmaking with digital construction. Large structures could be represented through practical sets, while the surrounding landscapes, architecture, skies, mountains, fortifications, or supernatural spaces could be expanded digitally. This approach is particularly valuable in fantasy filmmaking because it allows the filmmakers to preserve the tactile quality of real objects while achieving a much larger apparent scale. A practical wall can look convincing because actors can touch it. A real staircase gives performers something physical to interact with. A real floor creates natural contact between bodies and objects. Digital environments can then extend these physical elements beyond the edges of the set. This combination is often more convincing than constructing everything digitally. The viewer may not consciously identify which parts are real and which are computer-generated. That is actually one of the goals of visual effects. The effect should support the illusion rather than constantly announce itself. Immortals, however, deliberately uses stylization. The filmmakers were not necessarily trying to make every effect invisible. Some sequences are intentionally exaggerated. The gods' movements are designed to look almost impossibly elegant. Their combat is faster and more precise than ordinary human fighting. The Titans have a supernatural physicality. The environments are sometimes presented with heightened textures and dramatic scale. This means that the effects are part of the movie's artistic identity. The technology was also important for the representation of the gods. The gods are among the most difficult characters to portray in the film because they are supposed to exist on a level above ordinary humans. If they simply looked like people wearing elaborate costumes, the audience might not immediately understand their supernatural status. The production therefore uses costume design, lighting, digital enhancement, choreography, and visual effects together. The gods appear physically perfect and unusually controlled. Their movements communicate power. Their combat sequences use rapid motion and slow motion in combination to make their abilities appear fundamentally different from those of mortals. This creates a visual distinction between divine and human action. Human battles tend to feel heavy. Weapons collide with bodies. Armor is damaged. People fall. Movement has physical consequences. Divine combat is more fluid. The gods seem capable of crossing distances almost instantaneously. They can perform movements that would be impossible for ordinary warriors. This contrast is a storytelling tool. The audience learns about the hierarchy of the world through motion. The gods do not need to explain that they are superior. The effects demonstrate it. The most important supernatural visual effects are associated with the Titans. The Titans represent a difficult visual problem because they are not simply large human characters. They are ancient beings who have been imprisoned and separated from the normal world. Their physical appearance has to communicate imprisonment, violence, age, and supernatural power. Computer-generated imagery allows the filmmakers to create beings that would be extremely difficult to portray through conventional prosthetics alone. The Titan sequences, therefore, depend heavily on digital compositing and creature effects. The challenge with any digital creature is making it appear physically present. If a creature looks too clean or weightless, the audience immediately recognizes the computer-generated nature of the image. The filmmakers, therefore, had to create convincing interaction between the creatures and their surroundings. Lighting is particularly important. A digital creature must appear to receive the same light as the environment. Its shadows must make sense. Its movement must have weight. Its interaction with objects must appear physically believable. Its scale must remain consistent. The emotional impact of Immortals comes from the contrast between its enormous mythological scale and the deeply personal experiences of its central characters. On the surface, the film is a story about gods, titans, armies, magical weapons, prophecy, and an impending war. But underneath the spectacle is a story about grief, family, revenge, love, fear, sacrifice, mortality, and the desire to give meaning to suffering. This contrast is important because spectacular action alone does not necessarily create emotional investment. Audiences can admire a battle without caring about the people fighting it. For a fantasy epic to become emotionally effective, the audience needs to understand what the characters are fighting for. Immortals attempts to establish that emotional foundation through Theseus. His story begins with a relationship rather than a battle. He lives with his mother. Their relationship gives his character a sense of humanity before the mythology becomes overwhelming. His mother represents safety, family, memory, and the small world in which he has grown up. Theseus may eventually become involved in a conflict involving gods and titans, but his emotional journey begins with something much simpler. He wants to protect someone he loves. That motivation makes him accessible. The audience does not need to understand Greek mythology to understand the fear of losing a parent. It does not need to understand the politics of an ancient kingdom to understand what it means to watch someone you love become vulnerable. It does not need to understand prophecy to understand grief. This emotional simplicity gives the larger story a foundation. The early relationship between Theseus and his mother also establishes an important idea that continues throughout the movie. Theseus' strength is connected to attachment. He is not heroic because he is emotionally detached. He is heroic because he cares. This is particularly important in comparison with Hyperion. Hyperion has also suffered tremendous loss. But instead of allowing his pain to deepen his connection to other people, he allows it to separate him from humanity. He responds to suffering through hatred. Theseus eventually responds through protection. The two characters therefore begin from similar emotional territory, but move in opposite directions. This makes the emotional conflict between them more meaningful. One of the most powerful emotional elements of the story is grief. Loss is everywhere in Immortals. Characters lose family members. Communities are destroyed. Warriors die. People are separated from those they love. The gods themselves exist in a world where immortality does not eliminate emotional consequences. The film repeatedly reminds the audience that physical power cannot completely protect anyone from loss. This is particularly important because the title suggests immortality. The audience might initially assume that immortality means freedom from death. The film complicates that idea. Even beings who are physically immortal can experience emotional pain. They can lose people. They can witness suffering. They can face the consequences of human decisions. Immortals can achieve a different kind of immortality through memory and legend. This makes death one of the central emotional themes of the movie. Death is not simply an action movie consequence. It is part of the film's philosophy. Because Theseus is mortal, every sacrifice carries greater significance. He does not have infinite opportunities. He cannot simply regenerate. He cannot return to life whenever he wants. His choices therefore have weight. The audience understands that when he enters battle, survival is not guaranteed. This creates tension even during scenes where the outcome may appear predictable. The emotional impact of an action scene depends partly on what the audience believes can be lost. Theseus's vulnerability, therefore, makes his heroism more meaningful. Another important emotional relationship is between Theseus and Phaedra. Their connection gives the story a romantic and human dimension. Phaedra is not simply a love interest inserted into an action story. She is connected directly to the mythology through her abilities as an oracle. This makes her relationship with Theseus unusual. She represents both intimacy and uncertainty. She can see possibilities that others cannot. Theseus is someone who must act without knowing exactly what the future will bring. Their relationship therefore connects romance with the film's larger themes of fate and free will. The emotional importance of their relationship comes from the fact that it gives Theseus something to protect beyond his own survival. Once he begins to care about Phaedra, the larger conflict becomes personal in another way. He has more to lose. This is a common principle in dramatic storytelling. Love raises the emotional stakes because the hero is no longer fighting only for an abstract cause. He is fighting for people. However, The relationship also introduces vulnerability. The more Theseus cares about Phaedra, the more dangerous the conflict becomes. Hyperion's world is one in which human attachments can be exploited. The emotional stakes, therefore, increase as the relationship develops. Phaedra also contributes to the film's emotional tension through her visions. Prophecy is emotionally difficult because knowing that something might happen can be almost as frightening as knowing that it will happen. A character who has no knowledge of the future can react to events as they occur. A prophet has to live with possibilities. Phaedra's visions place her in this uncomfortable position. She sees danger. She understands that certain outcomes may be approaching, but she cannot necessarily control them. This creates anxiety. It also raises the question of whether knowing the future is actually a blessing. If a person knows that suffering may occur, can they prevent it? If they try to prevent it, could their actions accidentally cause it? These questions add emotional complexity to her character. The film's treatment of prophecy, therefore, contributes to the atmosphere of inevitability. The audience often feels that the characters are moving toward events they cannot completely escape. This creates a tension between destiny and choice, and that tension affects the emotional experience of the story. One of the most emotionally significant aspects of Theseus's journey is the destruction of his ordinary life. The hero's journey requires the protagonist to leave the world he knows. But in Immortals, this is not simply a voluntary adventure. When discussing Immortals as an adaptation, the first and most important point is that the movie is not a direct adaptation of a single ancient Greek text, novel, comic book, or historical account. Instead, it is an original fantasy story that borrows heavily from Greek mythology and reshapes familiar mythological figures, concepts, names, and stories into a new cinematic narrative. This distinction is extremely important. Immortals is not simply a film version of the story of Theseus. It is not a straightforward retelling of the Minotaur myth. It is not a direct adaptation of the Titanomachy. It is not a literal interpretation of the stories surrounding the Olympian gods. Instead, the filmmakers take elements associated with these traditions and combine them with original characters, invented relationships, altered mythology, fictional historical circumstances, and a modern action film structure. The result is best understood as a mythological reimagining. The movie uses ancient mythology as raw material rather than treating it as a script that must be reproduced faithfully. This gives the filmmakers considerable freedom. They can take characters that audiences already recognize and place them in circumstances that did not exist in the original myths. They can change motivations. They can change relationships. They can change chronology. They can combine different myths. They can invent new mythology. They can make familiar characters serve completely different dramatic purposes. This is exactly what Immortals does. The most obvious example is Theseus. In Greek mythology, Theseus is one of the most important heroes of ancient Athens. He is associated with numerous adventures, political traditions, heroic stories, and legends. His most famous adventure is the journey to Crete, where he enters the labyrinth and defeats the Minotaur. He is also connected to Ariadne, King Minos, the Athenians, the Amazon tradition, and various other episodes. The cinematic Theseus is very different. Immortals presents him as a young mortal warrior who is raised by his mother in humble circumstances. He is not introduced as a famous prince or established political leader. He does not begin the story as a legendary hero. His heroic identity is something that develops through the events of the movie. This is a major creative change. The filmmakers essentially take the name and broad heroic identity of Theseus and reconstruct the character for a completely different story. The mythological Theseus already has a legendary reputation. The cinematic Theseus has to earn his. This change allows the movie to create a conventional modern hero's journey. The audience meets an inexperienced young man. He suffers. He learns. He fights. He forms relationships. He faces a larger threat. He becomes a leader. He eventually becomes a legendary figure. That structure would be much more difficult to achieve if the movie simply presented Theseus as an already established mythological hero. The filmmakers therefore use the mythology as a foundation, but rebuild the character around a modern dramatic arc. The same process occurs with the Minotaur. The Minotaur is one of the most recognizable creatures in Greek mythology. In the traditional story, the Minotaur is a monstrous being with the body of a human and the head of a bull. He lives inside the labyrinth constructed by Daedalus for King Minos. Athens is required to send young men and women to Crete as tribute, and Theseus eventually enters the labyrinth and kills the creature. This is one of the most famous monster myths in Western culture. Immortals does not reproduce that story literally. Instead, the film creates a different encounter with the Minotaur concept. The creature becomes part of Theseus's early transformation and functions as a physical representation of the brutality surrounding him. The labyrinth itself is not recreated in the traditional form as the central location of the story. This is a major departure. The filmmakers take the iconic monster and reinterpret its narrative function. Rather than building the entire movie around the traditional Theseus and Minotaur adventure, they use the concept as one stage in a much larger story. This is characteristic of the film's entire approach to mythology. Familiar elements are retained because they carry cultural associations, but their traditional context is altered. The audience recognizes the reference without requiring the movie to repeat the original myth. This creates a kind of mythological shorthand. When viewers see the Minotaur, they immediately associate it with Theseus. The movie can therefore communicate a connection between its hero and the ancient legend without spending the entire film retelling that legend. This is useful from a storytelling perspective. The filmmakers are essentially telling the audience that this is Theseus, but not necessarily the Theseus they already know. The same approach applies to the gods. The movie includes Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, Ares, Apollo, and other divine figures associated with the Greek pantheon. However, their personalities and narrative functions are adapted to fit the movie's own mythology. The gods are presented as physical beings who exist within the same universe as humanity. They are powerful but subject to rules. They are capable of intervening in human affairs but are also restricted by divine law. They have relationships with one another. They possess personalities. They have disagreements. They can die under certain circumstances. These details are not a straightforward representation of ancient Greek religious belief. They are cinematic inventions. The film creates its own system of divine rules. This is particularly important because the ancient Greek gods themselves are extremely inconsistent across different myths. There is no single ancient Greek mythology in the sense of one definitive canon that every story follows perfectly. Different poets, playwrights, historians, regions, and periods presented gods differently. Stories changed over centuries. Characters could have different origins and relationships depending on the source. Therefore, a modern filmmaker has considerable interpretive freedom. Immortals takes advantage of that freedom. The gods are not presented as historically accurate religious figures. They are characters in a fantasy adventure. This allows the film to make them function according to the needs of its dramatic structure. Zeus becomes particularly important because he acts as both a god and a mentor figure. Immortals is a film that becomes more interesting when it is examined beyond its basic plot. On the surface, it is a straightforward mythological action story involving Theseus, Hyperion, the gods, the Titans, the Epirus Bow, and a coming war. But underneath that surface, the film contains numerous references to Greek mythology, visual parallels, symbolic details, character connections, and pieces of foreshadowing that can be easy to miss during a first viewing. Some of these details come directly from ancient mythology. Others are deliberate reinterpretations. Some are visual references rather than literal story connections. And some are best understood as thematic parallels rather than conventional Easter eggs. This distinction is important because Immortals is not trying to reproduce Greek mythology exactly. As discussed in the previous section, the movie creates its own version of the mythological world. Therefore, Hidden details often work by reminding the viewer of older stories while simultaneously changing their meaning. One of the most obvious hidden connections is the relationship between Theseus and the Minotaur. Audiences familiar with Greek mythology immediately understand that Theseus is traditionally famous for defeating the Minotaur. In the classical story, the Minotaur is connected to the labyrinth of Crete, and Theseus enters the labyrinth in order to kill the creature. Immortals deliberately plays with this expectation. The film introduces a Minotaur-like creature relatively early in Theseus' story, but the encounter is not simply a direct reproduction of the classical myth. This means the movie is effectively acknowledging the audience's prior knowledge while presenting a different version. The hidden detail is therefore not simply that the Minotaur appears. The deeper detail is that the filmmakers are using the audience's expectation of the Minotaur myth as part of the character's identity. When viewers recognize Theseus confronting a Minotaur, they immediately understand that the film is deliberately connecting this new character with a legendary hero. The scene functions almost like a cinematic signature. It says that this is Theseus, even though the story around him is different. The film's treatment of the labyrinth is another example. The classical labyrinth is one of the defining images of the Theseus myth. But Immortals does not make the labyrinth the central location of the story in the same way a traditional adaptation would. Instead, the movie uses enclosed spaces, tunnels, underground environments, prison-like structures, and complicated passages to create a sense of entrapment. These locations can be interpreted as visual echoes of the labyrinth. The labyrinth in mythology is not only a physical structure. It is also a symbolic representation of confusion, fear, and the hero's movement toward the unknown. Immortals repeatedly places its characters in environments that create a similar emotional effect. Theseus moves through spaces where he cannot see the entire path ahead. He enters dangerous areas without knowing exactly what waits for him. He is forced to trust instinct and courage. This makes the labyrinth concept part of the film, even when the classical labyrinth itself is not the central setting. Another important hidden connection concerns the oracle. Phaedra's role as an oracle connects Immortals with one of the most important traditions of ancient Greek storytelling. Oracles were figures through whom divine knowledge could supposedly be communicated to humans. The most famous historical example is the Oracle of Delphi, associated with Apollo. In mythology, prophetic knowledge is often ambiguous. A prophecy can be technically true while being misunderstood by the person receiving it. This ambiguity is important because Immortals uses prophecy to create uncertainty. Phaedra's visions do not simply provide the audience with a complete instruction manual. Instead, they create questions. What does the vision mean? Can it be avoided? Is it a prediction or a warning? Does knowing about the future change the future? These questions are part of the traditional mythology surrounding prophecy. The film, therefore, uses the oracle character not merely as a plot device, but as a connection to the larger tradition of Greek tragedy. The presence of an oracle also reinforces one of the film's most important themes, the conflict between fate and free will. This theme appears repeatedly. Characters believe that certain events are destined. Other characters attempt to change those events. The audience is encouraged to wonder whether the future is fixed or whether choices can alter it. This is not just background mythology. It is part of the structure of the story. The hidden detail is that the prophecy itself can be viewed as a test of character. Knowing that something terrible might happen does not tell a person how to respond. The prophecy creates pressure. The choice creates meaning. This is why Phaedra's visions are important even when they do not provide clear answers. They force the characters to confront uncertainty. Another important detail is the significance of the gods' visual appearance. The Olympian gods are intentionally separated from ordinary humans through their costumes, movement, physical perfection, and visual presentation. They are not simply dressed as warriors. They are presented almost as idealized versions of humanity. Their bodies, armor, and movements create a sense that they exist on another level of physical existence. This reflects the traditional idea of the gods as beings who possess extraordinary beauty and power. But the movie also gives them a contemporary visual language. They can resemble superheroes. They move with impossible speed. They possess extraordinary combat abilities. Their appearances are carefully designed to make them instantly recognizable. This creates a hidden connection between ancient gods and modern superhero mythology. The film essentially translates the Olympian pantheon into the visual vocabulary of contemporary action cinema. The gods are supernatural beings who have extraordinary abilities and responsibilities. Modern superhero stories often operate in a similar way. The difference is that Immortals gives these archetypes mythological names. This makes the film part of a larger cinematic tradition in which ancient gods and modern superheroes occupy similar narrative territory. The symbolism of Zeus is especially interesting. Zeus is not simply the strongest god in the story. He is also a figure of restraint. When Immortals was released in 2011, it entered the marketplace as a large-scale fantasy action film designed to compete for the same broad audience that had made mythology, superheroes, sword and sandal adventures, and visually spectacular blockbusters commercially attractive. The movie was not positioned as a small experimental fantasy. It was designed as an event picture. It had a recognizable mythological concept, a substantial production budget, major international distribution, an ensemble cast that included Henry Cavill, Mickey Rourke, Freida Pinto, Luke Evans, John Hurt, and Stephen Dorff, and a visual style intended to distinguish it from more conventional historical adventures. The commercial strategy was therefore based on spectacle. The movie needed audiences to believe that it was something worth seeing on a large screen. Its mythology was familiar enough to attract attention, while its visual presentation was designed to make the film feel new. This combination was particularly important in 2011. The fantasy and action markets were already crowded. Audiences had access to superhero movies, fantasy franchises, historical epics, science fiction, and large-scale adventure films. Immortals had to establish its own identity within that environment. Its marketing emphasized gods, monsters, warriors, violence, mythology, and highly stylized imagery. The film's promotional campaign made its visual identity one of its most important selling points. Rather than presenting itself primarily as a historically grounded account of ancient Greece, it was sold as a dark and spectacular mythological fantasy. That distinction was commercially significant. A historical drama can attract audiences interested in period realism. Immortals instead targeted viewers looking for spectacle. The film's title itself also helped establish its connection with mythology. The word Immortals immediately suggested gods, supernatural beings, and an epic conflict beyond ordinary human history. This gave the marketing campaign a simple concept to communicate. The movie could be summarized through a few recognizable ideas. A mortal hero, powerful gods, ancient monsters, a brutal king, an approaching war, a supernatural weapon, a battle between humanity and forces from beyond the mortal world. These concepts are easy to communicate in trailers and posters. The financial expectations surrounding the movie were consequently substantial. A film of this scale requires significant investment. Large visual effects sequences cost money. International locations and elaborate sets cost money. Costumes, armor, weapons, stunt work, post-production, digital effects, marketing, distribution, and theatrical prints or digital delivery all add to the cost. The publicly reported production budget for Immortals was generally placed in a range of roughly $75 million, although different industry estimates can vary depending on how production and related expenses are calculated. That figure placed the film firmly in the category of major commercial releases. A budget of that size means that box office performance matters enormously. A film does not simply need to recover the money spent filming it. The studio and distributors also have to account for marketing, distribution costs, theater revenue splits, and other expenses. Therefore, a movie's worldwide box office total cannot simply be compared directly with its production budget to determine profit. This is an important point when evaluating Immortals. The film earned approximately $226 million worldwide during its original theatrical run. That figure represents a significant commercial return in absolute terms. However, it does not mean that the movie generated $226 million of profit for its studio. Theatrical revenue is divided between exhibitors and distributors. International markets operate under different financial arrangements. Marketing costs can be substantial. Additional expenses also exist outside the headline production budget. Therefore, the correct interpretation is that Immortals generated a strong enough worldwide theatrical gross to demonstrate significant commercial appeal, but its financial performance needs to be evaluated within the context of its production and marketing costs. The movie opened strongly in North America. Its opening weekend demonstrated that the film had successfully attracted an audience interested in mythology and action. The opening was particularly important because fantasy blockbusters often depend heavily on early audience awareness. If a large percentage of the target audience attends during the opening period, the film has a better chance of becoming a commercial success before competing releases or word-of-mouth affect its performance. Immortals benefited from the familiarity of its genre. Audiences already understood the basic appeal of a mythology-based action movie. The film's trailers and advertising communicated its visual style clearly. This meant that viewers who were attracted to the concept knew roughly what kind of experience they were buying. However, opening weekend performance is only part of the story. Long-term theatrical performance depends heavily on audience response. If a film receives extremely strong word of mouth, it can continue performing well over multiple weeks. If audiences are disappointed, the box office can decline rapidly after the opening. Immortals occupied an interesting middle ground. It attracted a significant audience, but critical reception was mixed rather than overwhelmingly enthusiastic. This affected the way the movie was perceived commercially. The film was clearly not a financial disaster. It generated substantial revenue around the world, but it also did not become the enormous franchise-launching phenomenon that its visual scale might have suggested. This distinction is important. The movie was commercially viable, but did not transform into a major long-running cinematic franchise. One of the reasons is that the business model surrounding Immortals was partly dependent on the possibility of creating a larger mythology. The story has enough world-building to suggest additional adventures. The gods, titans, heroes, and mythological conflicts could theoretically support future films. The commercial success of the first movie would therefore have been relevant to any plans for expansion. But the film's performance did not create the kind of overwhelming cultural momentum that typically encourages a studio to immediately build an extensive franchise around a property. Immortals, 2011, page 14, Fan Community and Fandom. The fan history of Immortals is particularly interesting because the movie occupies an unusual position in popular culture. It was released as a major theatrical fantasy film with a recognizable cast, a large production budget, ambitious visual effects, and a mythology-based story, but it never developed into the enormous franchise that its concept might have suggested. There was no long series of sequels. There was no sprawling cinematic universe. There was no enormous merchandising empire. There was no massive convention culture built specifically around Immortals. And yet the movie did develop a dedicated audience. That audience has remained interested in the film for reasons that go beyond its original box office performance. Some viewers are attracted to Greek mythology. Others are fans of Henry Cavill. Some enjoy the movie's visual style. Others appreciate its violent fantasy action. Some are interested in the film because of its interpretation of Theseus, Zeus, the Titans, and the Minotaur. And there are viewers who simply remember it as one of the distinctive fantasy films of the early 2010s. This combination has allowed Immortals to develop a form of long-term cult appreciation. It is important to distinguish between mainstream fandom and cult fandom. Mainstream fandom surrounds properties that dominate popular culture. These franchises tend to have enormous online communities, official merchandise, conventions, fan clubs, collectibles, cosplay events, and years of continuing media coverage. Cult fandom works differently. A cult film may have a much smaller audience, but that audience can be unusually passionate. People may repeatedly revisit the film. They may discuss its strengths and weaknesses. They may defend aspects that critics disliked. They may create fan theories. They may analyze individual scenes. They may compare the film with other works. They may recommend it to people who missed it during its original release. Immortals fits more comfortably into this second category. Its fan community has never reached the scale of the largest fantasy franchises, but the people who continue discussing it often have specific reasons for doing so. One of the most important sources of renewed interest has been Henry Cavill. When Immortals was released, Cavill was still developing his position as a major international star. His performance as Theseus gave him one of his early leading roles in a large-scale fantasy production. In the years that followed, he became increasingly recognizable through major franchise work. This changed the way many viewers encountered Immortals. Someone who discovered Cavill through later roles could go backward through his filmography and find Immortals. This created a second wave of attention. The movie became part of the actor's pre-superstar history. For fans of Cavill, Immortals can therefore be interesting as an early example of his development as an action leading man. Viewers can observe his physical presence, fighting style, screen charisma, and ability to carry a large-scale production before he became associated with some of his most famous roles. This does not mean that the entire Immortals fandom consists of Cavill fans, but his later popularity undoubtedly gave the movie additional visibility. The same phenomenon occurs with many films. An actor becomes famous after a movie is released, and audiences later return to earlier projects. The earlier film acquires a new context. Immortals benefits from that effect. Another important source of fandom is Greek mythology itself. Mythology has an unusually durable audience. People encounter it through school, literature, art, video games, television, movies, books, and popular culture. The names of Zeus, Athena, Ares, the Titans, the Minotaur, and Theseus remain recognizable even among people who have never read the original myths. This gives Immortals a built-in subject for discussion. Viewers can compare the film with the stories they already know. They can debate whether the changes work. They can identify references. They can discuss whether a character's portrayal is faithful. They can analyze the differences between the film and classical mythology. This makes the movie particularly suitable for online discussion. A completely original fantasy world may require people to learn its mythology before they can discuss it. Immortals starts with mythology that already exists in the cultural imagination. The conversation can therefore begin immediately. One of the most common forms of fan discussion concerns accuracy. Viewers familiar with Greek mythology often notice that the film changes major characters and events. Theseus is significantly reimagined. Phaedra is transformed into an oracle. Hyperion becomes a mortal antagonist rather than simply functioning as the mythological titan. The Minotaur is reinterpreted. The gods are given different dramatic roles. The Titan conflict is redesigned. These changes naturally create debate. Some viewers criticize the film because they want a more faithful mythological adaptation. Others argue that mythology has always been adapted and that the filmmakers were entitled to create their own version. This disagreement has helped keep the movie discussable. There is an important difference between a movie that everyone agrees is accurate and a movie that creates arguments about interpretation. Immortals belongs to the second category. Its departures from mythology become part of its identity. Fans can ask why the filmmakers made certain changes. They can compare the film's characters with classical versions. They can explore whether the alterations improve the story. And they can discuss whether the movie should even be judged according to historical accuracy. This creates a richer conversation than simply asking whether the movie is entertaining. Another area of fan interest is the film's visual design. Immortals has a very distinctive appearance. The movie uses highly stylized costumes, elaborate armor, dramatic landscapes, carefully designed sets, supernatural environments, slow-motion action, digital creatures, and heavily choreographed combat. Even viewers who dislike aspects of the screenplay may acknowledge that the film has a recognizable visual identity. This has made it attractive to people interested in fantasy, cinematography, and concept art. Online discussions frequently focus on individual images, costumes, characters, weapons, and action sequences. Fans can pause scenes and examine the design of the gods. More than a decade after its theatrical release, Immortals occupies a very different cultural position from the one it had when it first appeared in cinemas. In 2011, the movie was presented as a major fantasy event. It had an expensive production, a recognizable cast, a large marketing campaign, ambitious visual effects, a mythology-based story, and a highly stylized visual identity. Audiences were encouraged to see it as a spectacular theatrical experience. Critics, meanwhile, were much more divided. Some admired its visual ambition and action sequences. Others criticized its screenplay, characterization, dialogue, and unconventional treatment of Greek mythology. The result was a movie that generated attention, but did not receive the kind of universal enthusiasm that transforms a release into an enduring mainstream classic. Today, however, the way Immortals is discussed has changed. The film is no longer judged primarily as a new theatrical blockbuster. Instead, it is increasingly viewed as a product of its era. It is an example of the early 2010s fascination with stylized fantasy, mythology, digital effects, violent action, and visually extreme interpretations of ancient stories. This change in context matters. When a film is new, audiences compare it with what is currently competing for their attention. Years later, audiences compare it with cinematic history. That can substantially alter perception. Immortals is now easier to understand as part of a particular period in Hollywood filmmaking. The early 2010s were full of experiments with large-scale mythology. Studios were looking for new fantasy properties that could potentially become franchises. Three-dimensional theatrical presentation was still an important selling point. Digital effects had become sophisticated enough to create enormous supernatural environments, and filmmakers were increasingly comfortable combining historical imagery with comic book aesthetics. Immortals belongs directly to this environment. Its visual language makes much more sense when viewed alongside the other fantasy and action films of the period. Rather than appearing completely isolated, it becomes part of a larger movement. This does not automatically make the film better, but it gives it context. One of the biggest changes in its modern reputation concerns Henry Cavill. When Immortals premiered, Cavill was a promising actor, but not yet the global star that he would become. His later career transformed the way audiences see his performance as Theseus. After becoming widely known for major fantasy and superhero roles, Cavill's early movies gained additional attention. Viewers interested in his career began looking backward. Immortals became part of that retrospective journey. This has helped the movie remain visible. Someone who discovers Cavill through a later role may eventually encounter Immortals and watch it as an early demonstration of his ability to lead an action film. This gives the movie a historical significance that was not fully apparent in 2011. It becomes part of the story of a major actor's career. The same principle applies to the film's visual style. In 2011, some of the movie's effects and stylistic choices were judged according to contemporary expectations. Today, viewers can see them as examples of the period's approach to digital filmmaking. The visual effects may not always look as naturalistic as those in later productions, but naturalism was not necessarily the primary goal. Immortals deliberately exaggerates reality. Its gods, monsters, landscapes, costumes, and battles often feel like moving paintings or illustrations rather than attempts at historical reconstruction. Modern viewers may therefore appreciate the film less for realism and more for atmosphere. This is an important shift. The question is no longer simply whether the effects look realistic. The question becomes whether the effects contribute to the movie's unique identity. In that respect, Immortals has aged in an interesting way. Some of its visual choices remain striking precisely because they are artificial. The movie does not try to make its mythology look ordinary. It wants the world to feel heightened. The gods should look like supernatural beings. The battles should feel larger than life. The monsters should seem almost impossible. The environments should feel like myth rather than documentary history. This gives the film a visual identity that remains recognizable. Another reason the movie's reputation has changed is the growing appreciation for cult cinema. Modern audiences are increasingly willing to revisit films that were dismissed or misunderstood during their original release. The internet has made this process much easier. People can recommend older movies through social media. Video essay creators can analyze forgotten films. Streaming platforms can introduce older movies to new audiences. Online communities can debate films years after their theatrical runs. As a result, movies no longer disappear simply because their opening weekend is over. Immortals has benefited from this environment. It can now be rediscovered without the pressure of its original marketing campaign. A viewer does not necessarily approach it expecting the next giant fantasy franchise. Instead, they may approach it as a visually unusual action movie. That change in expectations can improve the experience. Expectations are one of the most important factors in movie reception. If an audience expects a historically accurate interpretation of Greek mythology, Immortals may seem ridiculous. If an audience expects a realistic historical epic, the film may seem excessively stylized. But if the audience understands that the movie is essentially a fantasy interpretation of myth, its choices become easier to appreciate. The movie is not trying to reconstruct ancient Greece exactly as it existed. It is constructing a symbolic fantasy version of ancient Greece. That distinction is increasingly recognized by modern viewers. Another part of the modern reassessment involves mythology. There is now greater awareness that Greek myths have never existed as one fixed canon. Ancient stories were transmitted through different writers, regions, periods, and traditions. Characters often have different versions. Stories change. Relationships change. Events are interpreted differently. This makes the idea of a completely faithful cinematic adaptation more complicated.